So, John, thank you for taking the time to talk to me
Talk to me.
today. I very much appreciate it. It's going to be valuable for the students at the University of Waterloo. And we're going to talk a lot about, technology and its impact on society, particularly the world of business, but also perhaps society more generally. But I thought I'd start by asking you about your background and your book, Move Fast and Break Things, that was published in 2017, argued that the growth in the power of big tech had very negative social consequences. You used the media industry, where you spent a lot of years, as a case study. I was interested, you mentioned Napster. I know it well, but the people who are taking the course, most of them probably would have no experience of that. So I thought it would be useful to start by you telling us about how you saw the music industry change. It was a very early, I think, very good example of the impact of technology.
Well, the business changed radically in 2000. In my book, I use an example of, I worked for Bob Dylan in the band when I was young in the 60s. And Levon Helm, who was the drummer in the band, even though the band stopped recording in the late 70s, the band continued to make money from the fact that in the 80s, the CD came in, and so everybody renewed their record collection. And so the royalties continued to flow. And in 2000, two things happened. One, Napster started, and two, for Levon, he got throat cancer. And so he wasn't able to continue to perform as a singer. And his royalty income, which had been in the level of $100,000 a year, just stopped completely. Because if you could get music for free, why would you bother buying a CD or even, this was pre-Apple Music, and so there was no other way to do it. So if you look at it, the music industry was making domestically about 22 billion in 2000. And today, even with the rise of the streaming income, it's making 11 billion. But even maybe more dramatically, for instance, the newspaper industry was generating about 25 billion in advertising revenue, print advertising in 2000, and today it's generating about 5 billion. So needless to say, you can't pick up your paper every day without seeing some newspaper shut down. There are what we call news deserts in America, where there's no local news whatsoever. And everybody says, well, you've got CNN online or other things but none of those people are covering the local city council, police corruption in the local level. And so local news is pretty much decimated. And now, of course, it's coming to the movie business. Now, partially that was brought on by the pandemic, but the fact that, you're substituting digital dimes for analog dollars is pretty pervasive across the media industry. And, you may not know what Napster is, but you do know what YouTube is. And any piece of music that exists in the world is sitting on YouTube for free. And so there's no way for musicians to make a decent living as long as YouTube continues to assume that it has no responsibility to copyright holders, that this content is simply put up by users, and it's just running, it says a platform. This is nonsense. YouTube spends millions of dollars a year to filter out pornography, to filter out the most vicious of terrorist killings on video. So it does make decisions as to what goes on, like any newspaper or any other media company. And then, in essence, I would argue that Facebook is the largest media company in the world. It's a larger audience than any other media company by a factor of 10 or 20. And, you know, if you survey users, a great number of people say their main source of news is Facebook, as sad as that may sound.
Absolutely. And you went on from there to talk about the negative impact that the technology companies were having as being due to the business models and objectives that they had. So, which was basically saying, I think, that their overall approach was one that was inevitably going to be damaging to, large sections of business and society. Can you talk a bit about their business models and objectives?
Well, their business model is to pretend that what they offer the customer is free. Of course, if what you're getting for free, as someone once says, you're the product. So the business model is one of what has been known as surveillance capitalism. So their job is to accrue as much data about you, your habits, where you go, where you shop, what musicians you like, what politicians you like, whatever, and then use that to induce advertisers to pay premium rates to reach you in the middle of your feed in ways that seem to offer you a free product, but are not really offering you a free product at all. You're paying a decent amount of money for that. And if you look at the balance sheets of these companies, whether it's Google or Facebook, a huge amount of the value of these companies is what is known as intangible value. In business school terms, goodwill. And I would argue that most of that value is in the value of their database and what they hold. So if data is the new oil, as many people have argued, you are giving them for free a huge amount of value every time you go on. And of course, also, in terms of Facebook or YouTube, you're doing all the work for free. They don't have to pay people to create content. You're doing it. And so their inputs are all free. And of course, but they're collecting all the advertising revenue, and they're, needless to say, not sharing that with their user.
So that's very clear. Has COVID accelerated this? There are a lot of people saying that COVID has meant that the digital economy has, become bigger, become more dominant, maybe. So I was interested. You wrote in 2017, and you said the things that you've said so far. What do you think has happened since then, especially with COVID?
I think there's no doubt that it's accelerated a great deal. And all you have to do is look at the downtown office buildings in Los Angeles or New York, or probably even in Toronto. They're empty.
Yep.
80% of the people who are in the white collar jobs are working from home. Most companies, including Apple said yesterday that it was going to continue to let people work from home into at least to the end of next year. So, that has both good effects and bad effects. The good effects is obviously, if I'm a white collar worker, I actually get to see my children. I don't spend 2 hours a day commuting down to downtown Los Angeles. I'm not spewing a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere from my car. I probably am more productive because all that time that I spend in my car, I'm now spending in front of my computer. But if you're obviously an airline, your business is completely destroyed. And because companies have realized that maybe having to send that 2 or 3 executives to Denver for a meeting with a company was a complete waste of money, time, and energy that could be just as well done on a Zoom conference call, I think that will be a permanent change to the way companies do business, and that a great deal will happen. And now, in other ways, I mean, obviously, it's been shown that probably distance learning is not quite as effective as actual classroom instruction. And so, especially for younger children, it's probably deleterious in a way that we won't maybe see for 2 or 3 years, but we will certainly eventually see the effect. So, I would guess that the education system will go back to the way it used to be as soon as there's a vaccine and stuff like that. But I think, white collar office work will not return to the way it used to be. And in terms of the media industry, needless to say, I'm not positive that the movie theater business will ever revive to the level that it was before. And the very fact that last week Warner Brothers said that they were going to put all their films up on HBO Max, what's called day and date, in other words, the same day they go into the movie theaters, says to me that that's a major shift that probably might not go back to the way it was, even if the movie theater business begins to revive.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating the extent of the change that is happening at the moment. In retail, people buying things online and becoming used to doing that. What that's going to mean for main streets and high streets and malls is we're already seeing the effects of that. Shops are already closed and disappearing. Yeah.
And of course, the big will only get bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Amazon and Walmart will continue to dominate the retail sector in ways that were unimaginable 2 or 3 years ago.
Absolutely. I wanted also to talk about the American election. It led to discussion of the impact of technology on democracy, with some people arguing that democracy was either no longer possible or at least necessarily desirable. The support for democracy in Western countries is at a lower level than it has been historically. So I was interested in what you thought the challenges were to democracy today, and whether you thought that its survival was at stake, but also maybe whether technology could improve democracy.
Well, when I first put out my book, the subtitle was How Facebook, Google, and Amazon Cornered Culture and Undermined Democracy. And the British publisher actually said, we don't think you can make this claim that they undermine democracy. We want you to take that off the subtitle. And I fought a bitter battle. And then, of course, they realized that one of their companies, Cambridge Analytica, was actually doing just that. It was undermining democracy in behalf of Donald Trump in order to target people on Facebook in a way that, maybe Facebook could never imagine. I would make the argument that Facebook is a net negative for society, and that if it had never arrived, we would have never had Donald Trump. And the effects of it will go way beyond Donald Trump. I would argue that probably in the next 6 to 9 months, you will see a very powerful effort by what are known as anti-vaxxer groups, arguing that vaccines are going to make you sick, or this is all some plot by Bill Gates to implant stuff in your brain, or, I mean, there is a level of craziness on Facebook that no one ever imagined could possibly exist. I mean, it's on an insane level. If you look at the QAnon stuff, I mean, QAnon put out a thing 4 weeks, 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, that John F. Kennedy Jr. had actually not died, and he was in hiding, and he was going to come out and be Donald Trump's vice president. I mean, and this piece of information was shared 10 million times. Now, I mean, to my mind, I cannot possibly understand how the world got so insane. It's as if, I don't know if the Canadians know about this, but in the 1700s, we had a set of Salem witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts, in which, for some reason, people began to believe that women were witches, and they were. This is not far from what QAnon says, which is that these people eat the blood of babies, and they're pedophiles that have a secret cabal to control the government, and only Donald Trump can fight them. But a bunch of women got burned at the stake in that time, and people later said, Jesus, it must have been something in the water, or something must have happened to make a whole community turn crazy. But now we have this on an international basis. And we have a country in which, maybe 30 million people believe that Donald Trump won the election. Not only won the election, but won it by a large margin, even though the truth is he lost by 7 million votes. So, and that's all on Facebook, and maybe YouTube to some extent. But so, to my mind, I don't see the purpose of social media in terms of its effect on democracy. I think it's incredibly destructive. And as to whether technology could be used to improve democracy, the people who say democracy is dead are fascists. I mean, that's just flat out. They're fascist. And we've always had to deal with fascists for a long time, ever since Mussolini took power in the 20s in Italy. He thought democracy was a dead idea. Vladimir Putin thinks democracy is a dead idea. Probably Xi Jinping thinks it's a dead idea. But those are not people that we should be celebrating. So, I mean, to my mind, Facebook has got to figure out whether it wants to be part of the problem or part of the solution. And right now, it's a great part of the problem. And that's a sad thing. Now, whether technology could be used to organize local people in groups to do good things, I have no doubt that could be possible. But it's just not, that's not the main feature of Facebook at this point.
Yeah, so you're saying it could be used to improve democracy, but that isn't happening enough at the moment.
Right, because that doesn't fit their business model.
Right.
Their business model is to wind you up, get you so crazy that you'll stay on Facebook for hours and hours, going down the rabbit hole, as people call it, doom scrolling. And doom scrolling is how they make money. The longer you will stay on that platform, trying to find more conspiracy theories as to why, the Democrats stole the election, the more money they're going to make.
And on the other hand,
their calculation is just very simple. How many minutes per day do you spend on the platform? That's the metric that they show to Wall Street, and that's the metric that they're trying to increase on a daily basis.
So
by every trick they can think of.
So what you're saying is that their business model means that they have a financial interest in the decline of democracy.
Absolutely.
Okay, very clear. Okay, so democracy.
Just one other thing.
Go ahead.
Peter Thiel, who is on the board of Facebook, was the original outside investor, has said that he no longer believes that democracy and capitalism are compatible. In other words, he's a capitalist, but he doesn't believe in democracy. So he's been very clear.
Scary. And so, democracy is a subject we could talk about for a long time, but I've got a number of things that your opinion is valuable on. And the next one's around innovation and the impact of the tech sector on innovation itself. You've said that in the beginning, the internet was decentralized, it supported new business and innovation, and that now this has been replaced by the monopolistic position that Facebook, Apple, Google, and the big techs have established, and that this is stifling innovation. So I'm keen that you talk about that, you explain it, and if you have ideas as to what can be done about it, it would be interesting to hear those too.
Look, I would say that, the basis of the antitrust suits that were filed against both Google and Facebook in the last 3 weeks are all about this factor, that essentially their job is to buy up their competition and stop things. And I know just a very simple example of that actually kind of failed, but kind of succeeded on Facebook. So at one point, Facebook realized after it had bought Instagram that a new upstart called Snapchat was beginning to gain users, especially among young kids. And so they went to visit Snapchat and they offered them $2 billion to buy them out. And Evan Spiegel, who's the CEO, was a kind of arrogant young kid who said, no thanks, we're going to compete with you. And when they left, they said to him, going out the door, you may regret that. So they went home, and the key feature of Snapchat was called Snapchat Stories, which was a way of telling a story and annotating video and doing all sorts of other things. And so they basically went and they cloned everything about Snapchat Stories. And within about 3 months, there was WhatsApp stories, there was Instagram stories, Facebook stories, and the whole thing. They basically took every factor that Snapchat had that was differentiated and copied it. And there was nothing Snapchat could do about it. So, I mean, that's the kind of hardball they play. I mean, you have notoriously heard the stories of Amazon using its data to see what kind of young upstart companies were doing really well on their platform because they have a lot of independent sellers, and then basically either offering to buy the company, or if they fail to offer to buy it, then going to business themselves to make a private label version of whatever that was, whether it was diapers or a certain kind of shoe. And So, I mean, these people clearly stifle innovation. Now, as to what can be done, the history is pretty clear. In the 1950s, the United States had a monopoly phone company called AT&T. And AT&T had the largest research and development lab in the world called Bell Labs. And Bell Labs had developed the transistor, the microchip, the laser, the satellite, the cellular telephone system, basically all of the key components of the digital economy were developed by Bell Labs and obviously licensed for free to AT&T. So the government said to AT&T, if you want to maintain your monopoly, you have to license for free to any American company or individual every piece of your intellectual property. And they did. And out of that came a gigantic amount of competition. So the original Silicon Valley came from the licenses of the laser and the transistor, so that Hewlett-Packard, Fairchild Semiconductor, Intel, Texas Instruments, Motorola, all of those companies were born out of those free patents that they got from Bell Labs. And so then all of a sudden you had a huge amount of competition. So that's one way that you could change thing. If you force Google to give up all its intellectual property for free to any competitor, then you might have competition in search engine, you might have competition in online advertising, you might have competition in autonomous vehicles, you might have competition in all sorts of things like home automation.
And there are quite a few people arguing at the moment that the tech companies should be broken up. Do you think that makes sense?
Well, I argued in my book 3 years ago that Facebook should be forced to sell Instagram and WhatsApp. The original owners of Instagram didn't want to have a lot of data collection. That was part of their kind of manifesto, that they wouldn't collect any data except how old you were and what sex you were and what zip code you lived in. That was the only data they would collect on you. And needless to say, once Facebook bought it, that went out the window. So you could have imagined multiple social networks in America with different privacy policies competing, and maybe competing on the factor that we're not taking all your data. And that might have made a very more competitive landscape instead of Facebook controlling, 85% of the social network traffic in the world. So I think breakup would be good. I think, Google probably should be forced to sell DoubleClick, the advertising subsidiary.
Yep. And then beyond that, the US government and more so European governments and the European Union have been talking about regulation of the tech sector in a number of areas around control of data and ownership of data, privacy, taxation. I know that you think regulation is necessary. What do you see as the priorities for that? And how successful do you think regulation of the tech sector can be?
Go outside. Maggie, call Jenny, please.
Nice dog.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Okay. So you were what role does government have to play in all this?
Yeah, and as far as regulation goes, the US government's talking about it now. Europe have been doing it for a few years. I'm just interested in your views on that, particularly around, I think you say it's a good thing, but how effective is it, and what should happen with it in the future?
Well, I think it's, when you have monopolies that are unregulated, it's dangerous. So, I mean, we probably have to accept that Google is what is known as a natural monopoly. In other words, if you went to your students and said, I've decided to start a new search engine that's going to compete with Google, and I want you all to give me, a lot of money to fund this startup, your students would run out the other door. I mean, they're not going to do that. They know that Bill Gates spent $3 billion on Bing trying to compete with Google and failed completely. So, I mean, I don't think you're going to change the fact that Google is going to have 90% of the search market. But what you need to change is how Google is going to be regulated, just like any natural monopoly. You probably only have one electrical wire into your house. You have a monopoly of electricity or water, or, there are lots of utilities that are monopolistic. But they're regulated. They can't charge certain kinds of rates. And of course, Google can kind of charge advertisers anything it wants. What choice do they have? So, Amazon, if you're a bookseller, Amazon can extract all sorts of fees from you as a bookseller because you have no choice. If they want a fee to place your book high up on the stack, you'll pay the fee. If they want a fee for promoting your book, you'll pay the fee. If they want a fee for holding in their warehouse as opposed to taking 5 days to get it to customers, you'll pay the fee. So, I mean, the only solution in these situations when you have these monopolistic companies is to have the government interpose regulations. I mean, the second part of that would be, and I don't know what the case in Canada is, but in the United States, these companies have what is known as safe harbor. You cannot sue YouTube for putting your music on their platform for free, because they claim it's not them, it's the user. And so if you file a takedown notice to take down that piece of music, it may go down, but a day later, someone else puts it up. So it's like playing whack-a-mole. So none of this will be useful until the government interposes itself in either getting rid of these safe harbors and other regulatory factors. And quite honestly, some of the privacy legislation that's come out of Europe and California is actually having some effect.
Your new book is called The Magic Years, Scenes from a Rock and Roll Life. It sounds like it'll be a great read. It's due out in May, and it's said to argue that we need to rekindle our humanism, I think is one of the blurbs that came out about it. Why is that necessary, and how can we do this? How can we rekindle our humanism?
Well, the book is a kind of personal history of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I was lucky enough to be involved with George Harrison and Bob Dylan and the band and Janis Joplin and, a lot of important musicians. And then in the movie business with Martin Scorsese and Wim Wenders and a lot of important film directors. And one of the things that I argue is that in the last 10 to 15 years, at least the culture in the United States has turned very nihilistic. If you look at what are the most popular shows on television, they're all incredibly dark views of humanity, whether it's Breaking Bad, where the hero is a meth dealer, or whether it's Succession, where the heroes are the Murdoch family, essentially fictionalized, the most ruthless people in the media sphere, or Game of Thrones. These are all very dark views of humanity. And I believe that that has an effect on the culture. If all our heroes are anti-heroes as opposed to heroes, then we begin to think in a dystopian way about the future. And in fact, we begin to think that there is no real future. And you can see that in all sorts of statistics. The family formation and children bearing are declining radically across the globe. People's belief that the climate will, die are happening across the world. And so this notion that the culture is not pointing people towards a better world, but a darker world, is to me very problematic. And I was lucky enough to come up in at a time when the culture heroes like Bob Dylan were saying the times they are changing. The answer is blowing in the wind. They were positive visions that the future was going to be better than the past. And unless we get back to that, and if you look at the hip hop lyrics, it's all very dark and nihilistic. And I think that's reflected also in what Angus Deaton, the Princeton professor, calls deaths of despair. At least in the United States, I don't know about Canada, the statistics for suicide, drug addiction, and alcoholism are just on a up curve that's just astonishing, growing so much faster than any other country in the world. And so, culture has consequences, and that's what the book is about.
Wonderful. And that description, I think, will means that it is something that is, I think, very valuable for the world. You're almost saying that we've talked today about a number of negative aspects of the impact of technology, but in spite of all this, and the period since the 60s, when there was that optimism, you're saying we should still be optimistic today. We're better than this. A better world is possible, right? And that's a very important message today, right?
Right. And that needs to come from the academy as well as from the culture.
Absolutely. So with that in mind, I got one last question, which is that a lot of the people who are watching this will be early on in their careers, perhaps about to start them. And I wonder whether you had any words of advice that you would like to give them, especially given your career has been a fascinating one with all the various elements that it's had. So have you got any advice for them?
Well, I have had around 6 careers over the course of, I'm 73. So, I've had a lot of different careers. And the secret to that is always be open to change. Don't get locked into thinking I'm a biologist, or I'm a film director, or I'm a film producer, or whatever. You should be scanning the horizon to see where change is coming from and be willing to go there and take a chance on it, even if you're not sure what the result is. In other words, don't play it safe, because safe careers are boring careers, and, you know, I think you will always regret it. So my sense has always been, if something feels like it's getting old and boring, look for where there's something fresh and go towards it.
Absolutely. There's a famous Canadian who's living in your part of the world now, hockey player Wayne Gretzky, who used to say, skate to where the puck is going to be rather than where it is. And, you know, it's a similar expression, I guess, but good advice for the students. I'm really grateful to you for taking the time to do this today, John. I really appreciate it. And I know it's going to be valuable for the people who watch it.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it.